December 17, 1944. It's just after midnight in the freezing forests of Belgium. Snow is falling heavily, covering the narrow roads of the Ardennes under thick layers of white. A single military truck rumbles through the storm, its engine working hard with each frozen mile. Inside the front seat, a driver holds the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles have turned white. His windshield wipers move back and forth steadily, trying hard to keep up with the snowstorm. He is lost. Somewhere behind enemy lines, maybe. His map is no longer useful. It's torn at the edges, wet with sweat and covered with dirt. Road signs are missing or twisted around. Radio silence has been ordered. His group doesn't know where he is, and he has no clue where the front line really starts or ends. But in the back of his truck is a load more valuable than gold. Thousands of gallons of powerful fuel. Gasoline needed for American tanks, trucks, and big guns waiting at the edge of failure. Fuel for men who are cold, trapped, and almost out of choices. What this driver doesn't know is this. If he turns back now, if he runs out of fuel himself, or if he gets captured, then the German army, yes, the final desperate attack of Hitler's best tank units, might break through the Allied front. And if that happens, the war in Europe could change. History could change. But somehow, against all odds, this wrong turn, this one man's mistake, will become the turning point in one of the most terrible battles of World War II. And what he delivers will not just restart engines, it will bring back hope. This is the forgotten story of a man who was never supposed to be a hero. A driver who went the wrong way and brought the right thing to the right place at exactly the right time. The battle begins. Hitler's last big risk. The Ardennes, a forested area of hills, rivers, and icy valleys along the border of Belgium and Luxembourg. For most of the war, this area was thought to be quiet. Too thick with trees for tanks, too cold for long battles. That's exactly why Adolf Hitler picked it. On December 16, 1944, under the cover of darkness and snow, over 200,000 German troops pushed through the trees. They were supported by over 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles. Their goal? Punch a hole through the Allied line, rush to the Belgian port of Antwerp, and split the American and British forces in two. If they succeeded, they believed they could force a peace deal on the Western Front and maybe even turn the war around. This attack would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. But it wasn't just the huge numbers that made this attack scary. It was the speed. The Germans planned to attack fast before the Allies could regroup. They counted on secrecy, surprise, and fuel. Their tank columns had enough gasoline for just a few days of quick movement. If they moved too slowly or ran out, they would be stuck, and they knew it. On the American side, fear started to spread through the front lines. Entire groups were caught by surprise. Communication lines broke. Villages were taken over. The roads, already frozen and narrow, became crowded with escaping civilians and desperate convoys. But in the confusion, another problem came up. The Allies themselves were running low on fuel. Weeks earlier, the fast push through France had stretched their supply lines thin. Trucks were breaking down. Storage places were scattered and poorly protected. And the fuel delivery system, the lifeblood of every tank and truck, was in danger of falling apart. Behind every Sherman tank, every Jeep, every big gun, there was one important thing: gasoline. Not bravery, not weapons, not even good leadership, fuel. And without it, even the most powerful army in the world could be stopped completely. So when German forces started attacking Allied fuel storage places, capturing or destroying them, fear turned into being unable to move. There were stories of entire groups stranded, their tanks useless, their guns silent because the trucks carrying their gasoline never showed up. That's where our story begins, not on the front lines, but far behind them, with a man in a canvas-covered truck carrying nothing but fuel and hope through a storm, through confusion, through roads no one else dared to drive. And whether he lived or died, whether he made it or got lost forever, would help decide the outcome of the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. The driver who wasn't supposed to be there. His name was John Miller. Everyone called him Jack. He was not a hero. Not by his own words. He was a truck driver, one of tens of thousands of men whose job was to move fuel, food, and ammunition across muddy European roads. Jack was 31 years old. Before the war, he worked at a gas station in Pennsylvania. He knew the sound of an engine better than most men knew the sound of their own heartbeat. He could tell if a truck needed oil or if a part wasn't working right just by the way it coughed when it started. When he joined the Army, that skill earned him a spot in the motor transport group. the unsung backbone of the Allied advance. By December of 1944, Jack had been driving almost non-stop for months. From Normandy to the Siegfried Line, he had hauled barrels of fuel across bombed-out bridges and through villages that no longer existed. He had seen burned-out tanks, columns of smoke on the horizon, and faces of civilians who no longer had homes. But through it all, he kept driving. That was his mission. Fuel was life. Every drop that reached the front meant another tank that could move, another gun that could fire, another life that might be saved. And so when Jack received the order that cold December morning to deliver a full load of powerful gasoline to a tank division near the town of Stavelot, he didn't hesitate. He checked his tires. He cleaned his windshield. He tied his scarf twice around his neck, knowing how mean the Ardennes wind could be. Then he climbed into his truck, turned the key, and listened as the engine rumbled awake. The road ahead was supposed to be simple. A 3-hour drive, 2 checkpoints, 1 delivery. But nothing in war ever goes as planned. The German attack had already thrown the entire area into chaos. Road signs were missing or deliberately switched by enemy commandos disguised as American soldiers. Radio lines were jammed and supply maps printed weeks before no longer matched reality on the ground. Jack didn't know it yet, but the town he was supposed to reach was already under attack. Still, orders were orders. He shifted into gear. The truck groaned forward, and soon the familiar hum of the tires on the frozen road became the only sound in the world. Snow whipped across his windshield like knives of light. He drove past other convoys, some burned out, others abandoned. The silence of the forest was broken only by distant artillery, low, dull, constant. Every few miles he stopped to check his location, but the landmarks were gone. Trees shattered, houses burned, and the road signs that should have pointed him toward Stavelot now pointed toward nothing at all. Still, Jack pressed on because somewhere out there men were waiting for this fuel, men who believed that help was coming, and as long as he had a working truck and a heartbeat, Jack Miller would make sure it got to them. He didn't know it yet, but his next decision, just one wrong turn, would make him part of history. The wrong road. At first, the road seemed familiar. Jack had driven through enough Belgian countryside to know a muddy back road from a main supply route. But this one felt wrong. The trees leaned in too close. The turns came too sharp. And worst of all, he hadn't seen another vehicle for almost 20 minutes. Still, he pressed forward. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling like smoke across the windshield. His wipers screeched with every pass. He squinted, leaning forward in his seat, scanning the darkness for anything, any road sign, any marker, any signal that he was still on the right path. Nothing. The forest swallowed everything. There were no houses, no fences. No fences meant no farms. No farms meant he had drifted far from the main path of Allied movement. Jack slowed the truck. His hands tightened on the wheel. He thought about turning back, but something bothered him. He looked at the fuel gauge, still almost full, but not for long. This truck used gasoline like a battleship, and out here, alone in the snow, running out of fuel was the same as signing your own death sentence. He pulled over near a bend in the road and climbed down into the snow. The cold bit through his gloves. He unrolled a canvas map and held it against the hood of the truck, tracing his finger over the black lines, roads, towns, rivers, trying to match them to the area around him. But the truth hit like a punch to the stomach. The road he was on was not on the map. He stood there staring at that empty stretch of snow-covered dirt as a terrible realization settled into his bones. He was lost, and worse, he might be lost inside enemy territory. Jack turned, scanned the tree line, and then slowly walked around to the back of the truck. He placed a gloved hand on the side of the fuel tank. It was warm, alive, thousands of gallons of powerful gasoline sat just behind that steel wall. He was hauling the exact thing the Germans were running out of. If they found him, if a single scout patrol stumbled onto this lonely truck, he would not be taken prisoner. He would be turned into fire. Jack closed his eyes for a moment. Snow landed on his eyelashes. In that silence, his mind ran wild. Was this a trap road? Had enemy saboteurs changed the signs to trick convoys off course? He had heard the rumors about German soldiers dressed in American uniforms, switching signs, giving false directions. He had even seen one soldier shot for giving the wrong password at a checkpoint just a week before. He climbed back into the truck, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared back to life. That sound gave him courage. Not much, but enough. He had a decision to make. Sit still and hope help came, turn around and risk going back on a road that might already be taken over, or push forward alone into the unknown. He tapped the dashboard twice. "Come on, girl," he whispered. "We're not done yet." And with that, he shifted into gear and rolled forward onto a road he could not name, toward a place he could not see, carrying a load that could start a firestorm if it landed in the wrong hands. Behind him, his tire tracks were already disappearing under fresh snow. Ahead, the trees thickened. The wind picked up. The night grew darker, and still he drove. Surrounded by silence, the road narrowed. Trees crept closer, twisted branches forming a tunnel overhead. Jack switched off his headlights. He couldn't afford to be seen, not now. He drove by feel, one hand on the wheel, the other gripping a flashlight with a red lens that barely pierced the swirling snow ahead. The silence was complete. No voices, no birds, no gunfire, not even the wind. It was the kind of silence that made your breath sound too loud. The kind that made you feel watched even when you were alone. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He leaned forward again, peering through the windshield, scanning for shadows that didn't belong. Then movement. Far ahead, a flicker of light. He killed the engine. Silence rushed back in like a wave. He sat in the cab, frozen, not from the cold but from thinking hard. Too far to make out details, but close enough to feel real. Could be a campfire, could be a lantern, could be enemy soldiers warming their hands, laughing in German. Or it could be American, a lost patrol, an outpost, the edge of a friendly unit. Jack reached into the glove box and pulled out his sidearm, a standard-issue Colt pistol. He had never fired it in combat. He waited 1 minute, then 2, nothing. The light vanished. He waited longer, fingers numb around the grip of the pistol. Then somewhere in the distance, far off, maybe miles, came the low, unmistakable sound of an engine. Then another. Tank engines, heavy diesel, too far to identify but growing louder. And then silence again. Jack exhaled slowly. If those were German tanks, they were moving blind like he was, searching. If they were American, they might be too jumpy to welcome a lone fuel truck creeping through the woods. He couldn't risk either. He started the engine again, let it rumble for a moment, then rolled forward slowly, headlights still off. The snow let up just enough for him to see outlines of the road. He came to a junction, a fork where the road split into 3 narrow paths. There were no signs, no tire tracks, no markers. He stopped again, took the flashlight, stepped outside. The snow crunched softly under his boots. He scanned the area. On the trunk of a tree, he spotted something barely visible beneath the frost. Faint paint, a stencil, an American star. Hope surged in his chest. He scraped the bark with his knife. Yes, the star was faded but real, old but American. Someone had passed through here, recently, maybe not, but it meant something. He made his choice. Middle road. Back in the truck, he turned onto the center path, heart pounding, hands cold and steady. It was then that he noticed something else. A faint smell, burned oil, exhaust. Somewhere up ahead, something had been here recently or was still here. He followed the scent. Each mile dragged. Every bend could be a checkpoint or a trap or worse, nothing at all. He passed abandoned vehicles. One flipped over in a ditch, its wheels still spinning in the wind. Another riddled with bullet holes, snow collecting in the cab, but no bodies. That was somehow worse. Jack kept driving. The trees began to thin, and then after what felt like hours, though it had been less than 30 minutes, he saw it. Barbed wire, stacked sandbags, a low trench half buried in snow. He eased to a stop, and from the shadows, a voice called out, "Halt! Password!" Jack's hands shot into the air, his breath caught in his throat. He shouted back, clear and slow, "Philadelphia!" A pause then. "Advance and be recognized." Jack rolled forward slowly, hands still raised. A face emerged from the trench, American helmet, M1 rifle. Relief nearly made him collapse. The soldier waved him in. "You're late," the man muttered. "We were about to give up on your convoy." Jack shook his head. "I'm not a convoy. That answer drew silence. Then the soldier stared at the fuel drums in the back of the truck. "Is that what I think it is?" Jack nodded. "High-octane for the armor division. I got lost." The soldier whistled low. "You have no idea what you just did." And Jack finally exhaled. He had no idea, not yet. But the fuel in his truck had just reached the last position still holding in that area, and within the hour, it would be powering tanks that had been dead in the snow for 2 days. The delivery that changed everything. They moved fast. As soon as Jack's truck rolled into the makeshift American position, soldiers began pulling off the fuel drums. Cold fingers gripped steel handles. Men with frostbitten cheeks and tired eyes worked without speaking. Everyone knew what was at stake. This was the final outpost holding the line before the town of Trois Ponts, a critical junction of roads and bridges that, if lost, would open the door for German tanks to sweep deeper into Allied territory. For 2 days, this position had been barely hanging on. The tanks here, Shermans mostly, had not moved in 36 hours. Their crews slept beside them in the snow, holding rifles instead of levers, waiting for either fuel or orders to retreat. Neither had come until now. Jack climbed out of the cab, his legs stiff, his face raw from cold and nerves. He stood back and watched as fuel lines were run, pumps connected, and engines, silent for almost 2 days, finally coughed back to life. One by one, the Shermans came alive. The rumble of their engines broke the silence like thunder. Smoke poured from exhaust pipes. Turrets swiveled. Machine gunners climbed into position. A young lieutenant approached Jack, holding a clipboard with a shaking hand. "You came alone?" he asked. Jack nodded. The officer looked back at the truck, then at the tanks now rolling forward into battle. "That's impossible," he said. But it wasn't. It had happened, and it was just in time. Within the hour, German armored units from Kampfgruppe Peiper, some of the most brutal and determined in Hitler's army, were spotted moving toward the position. They had already taken Stavelot. They were hungry for fuel, desperate to break through, and they had no idea the Americans had just been refueled. The Shermans rolled out of the tree line, engines howling, tracks crushing frozen mud beneath their weight. They flanked the road, set up ambush points, and waited. When the Germans came, expecting silence and surrender, they were met with fire. Shells burst from tank barrels. Machine guns roared from every hill. The enemy, stunned by the sudden American resistance, fell back in confusion. The fuel Jack had delivered gave those men mobility. It gave them defense. It gave them life. It also denied the Germans the one thing they needed most: fuel of their own. You see, Hitler's entire gamble in the Ardennes depended on speed. Without surprise, without momentum, the German advance would stall, and when it stalled, it would die. That day it began to die. Historians now agree that engagement, small as it was, helped prevent Kampfgruppe Peiper from reaching the fuel depot at Trois Ponts and Spa. And without fuel, the German spearhead ground to a halt in the snow. They abandoned their vehicles. They tried to escape on foot. Many were captured. Some froze to death where they stood. Jack Miller never fired a weapon. He never gave an order. He never even left the supply route, at least not on purpose. But the fuel he delivered at the right moment in the right place turned the tide of a critical corner of the battle. He spent the night at the outpost, sleeping in the cab of his truck. When he woke up the next morning, an officer shook his hand and told him something he would never forget. "You saved a battalion," the man said. "You just don't know it yet." Jack never talked much about that day. After the war, he returned to Pennsylvania. Married, had 2 sons, drove trucks again, this time with no snow, no gunfire, no risk of ambush. He never asked for medals. He never claimed to be a hero. But the records are there. Fuel was delivered. Tanks were refueled. A line was held. And that changed everything. The collapse of Hitler's final attack. By the morning of December 19th, the German war machine was already slowing down. It had started with fury. 200,000 soldiers, over 1,000 armored vehicles. They struck the Ardennes like a hammer, punching a deep bulge into the Allied front line that gave the battle its name. But the hammer had no handle, no supplies, no resupply. Because despite the initial success, despite the panic, the fog, the chaos, Hitler's last gamble had one fatal flaw. It depended entirely on stolen fuel. The German high command knew it. They had calculated every mile, every gallon. They had enough fuel to get their tanks to Antwerp, but they didn't have enough to get them back. Their only hope was to capture Allied fuel storage places along the way. Storage places like the one near Trois Ponts. Storage places that were now heavily defended because one American driver, against all odds, had arrived in time. Without that fuel, German panzers began to stall. Tanks stopped dead in the snow. Crews abandoned them and continued on foot. In some places, vehicles were blown up by their own commanders to avoid capture. By December 22nd, the elite Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the German advance, was surrounded. They had run out of fuel. They had run out of food. They had run out of time. In total, they abandoned over 100 tanks and armored vehicles. Piper himself escaped on foot with just a handful of men. The rest were captured, killed, or scattered. The dream of splitting the Allied forces was over. Meanwhile, across the front, American resistance strengthened. Fuel arrived. Artillery found its voice again. Tanks rolled back into position. Paratroopers in towns like Bastogne, once cut off, held their ground until reinforcements could break through. And though the battle raged into January, the momentum had already shifted. The German army would never again launch a major attack in the West. In the cold silence of the Ardennes forest, the final hope of Hitler's regime froze to death alongside his tanks. And part of the reason, just one part, small but undeniable, was a single truckload of fuel that got where it needed to be. Delivered not by a general, not by a strategist, but by a man with frostbitten hands and a stubborn belief that the mission still mattered, even when the map stopped making sense. That's the part most history books forget, because history often talks about battles in terms of flags and arrows, of generals and orders, of treaties and turning points. But the Battle of the Bulge was not just fought by men in war rooms. It was fought by cooks, by radio operators, by medics, by fuel truck drivers who chose to go forward even when everything told them to turn back. Jack Miller was one of them. And while his name might not appear in strategy reports or battlefield briefings, his impact is written in the machines that moved, the guns that fired, and the men who lived to fight another day. Sometimes war is not won in a grand charge or a brilliant move. Sometimes it is won because a man refuses to stop driving. The Forgotten Soldiers. When the Battle of the Bulge finally ended in late January of 1945, more than 1 million men had fought in the forests of Belgium. 19,000 American soldiers were dead. Over 47,000 were wounded, and more than 23,000 were captured or missing. It was the costliest battle the United States Army would ever fight. But the world remembers Bastogne. It remembers Patton. It remembers the siege, the snow, the stubborn defense. Few remember the fuel trucks. Even fewer remember the names of the men who drove them. But behind every victory there are shadows. Men who did not pull triggers but pulled weight. Men who did not charge but endured. Men who never stood in front of cameras or saluted on parade grounds, but who changed the course of history with nothing but determination. Jack Miller was one of those men. When he came home in the spring of 1945, no one met him with banners, no reporters, no interviews. He stepped off the train in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, carrying a duffel bag and a limp in his right leg from weeks of cold weather exposure. He kissed his wife. He held his newborn son for the first time. Then he got a job driving delivery trucks for a hardware company. For decades, he never spoke of what happened that winter, not out of shame, but because no one ever asked. To him, it had just been a bad drive in a snowstorm. But he had kept going. That was enough. And maybe that's what heroism really looks like. Not medals, not speeches, just one man making a hard choice and not turning back. Years later, when his grandson asked him about the war for a school project, Jack finally told the story. The fuel, the wrong turn, the standoff at the trench. The boy, wide-eyed, asked him, "Did you know you were saving people?" Jack had just smiled and said, "I just knew they were waiting." That was it. No drama, no exaggeration, just truth. And it's a truth that matters because war is not only won by heroes. It's won by people who show up, who keep their word, who drive when the road is gone, who deliver something important when it matters most. The forgotten soldiers are not truly forgotten. Not if we remember what they stood for, what they carried, and what they refused to let go of, even in the darkest night. Jack was not alone. There were thousands of Jacks. Mechanics who fixed engines in the snow without gloves. Cooks who warmed food on shattered stoves. Medics who crawled through shell fire to reach the wounded. Clerks who typed supply lists through tears. They are the lifeblood of every army, and every victory stands on their shoulders. So when we tell the story of the Battle of the Bulge, let us remember not just the commanders and the battlefields, but the drivers in the dark, the ones who got lost and kept going. Because sometimes saving the world comes down to something as simple as refusing to stop. Jack was not a hero because he got it right. He was a hero because even when he got it wrong, he kept going. That's what makes his story timeless. It's the paradox of courage. Sometimes the path that saves everything is the one you were never meant to take, and sometimes it takes a wrong turn to find your way into history. Today, there is no statue of Jack Miller, no memorial plaque along that forest road. The fuel drums are long gone. The tanks he helped save are now museum pieces, and the soldiers he reached, those who lived, have grown old or passed on. But his legacy remains, not carved in stone but carried in principle. What about you? If you were in that cab, cold, lost, afraid, what would you have done? Would you have stopped? Would you have turned back? Or would you have kept going? Because sometimes history doesn't need a hero. It just needs someone who refuses to quit.